Data and evidence. We are inundated by it. Twitter users collectively tweet some 500 million times per day, which sounds like a lot until you realize 65 billion, that's with a B, WhatsApp messages are sent daily. The accumulated digital universe of data has grown tenfold in the last 7 years. That is, humanity has generated 10 times more digital data in the past 7 years than we did in the previous 75 years combined. That's a lot of data. We all recognize the importance of data, even if we don't self-identify as data crunchers. We're constantly using information from the world around us to navigate our lives. We're constantly triangulating from things we know, or at least things we think we know, to make conclusions about things we don't. The problem is that data do not exist in a vacuum. We each interpret it based on our lived experiences, biases, and cognitive processes. For this reason, data never speak for themselves. For example, here's a striking bit of data. After decades of slow but consistent progress in reducing global hunger, progress flatlined from 2011 to 2014, and has been trending upward ever since. The numbers here, from the just-released State of Food Insecurity in the World 2020 report, refer to chronic undernourishment, or persistent food consumption insufficient to provide energy levels required to maintain an active and healthy life. At this rate, we will become nowhere close to achieving the SDG 2.1 zero hunger target by 2030. And COVID is making things worse. The rosiest estimates for the effects of COVID on world hunger are an increase of 80 million additional people, roughly the population of Germany, being plunged into food insecurity. These numbers, as grim as they are, do not capture the 130 plus million people who experienced acute, near famine-like conditions of food insecurity in the past year, many of whom are still in crisis. Moreover, they don't accurately capture the increasing food insecurity in developed and middle-income countries where chronic food insecurity has largely been eradicated. So think kids who are missing out on free or reduced-price school lunches, for example. I'm guessing we can all agree that this is a grim picture. But that may be where the agreement stops. What kind of grim picture is it painting? What kind of problem is it suggesting? Is it evidence of a global food shortage, with too many mouths chasing too few calories? Or is it evidence that the global food system is not geared towards meeting the needs of the world's poorest and most vulnerable, even if food is more plentiful than at any point in human history? How we interpret the evidence in front of us has obvious implications for how we think about solving problems and pursuing opportunities. And we're a lot less aware of how we interpret what we consider objective evidence than we generally like to admit. Take this glass of water here. Is it half empty or half full? The answer isn't important in the technical sense, but we think the answer tells us an immense amount about the person offering it. There's a reason we speak of glass half empty and glass half full types of people, because we think the answer to this question tells us something meaningful about the way that person interprets reality around them. What I'm talking about, in essence, is a person's worldview. A worldview is a more or less coherent understanding of the nature of reality, which permits its holders to interpret new information in light of their preconceptions. They are not typically things we argue for, but rather from. They are the mostly unstated premises that govern our thought processes, premises of which we are often only dimly aware. Our worldviews are typically formed very early in life and are highly resistant to change, in part because they exist prior to and thus affect the interpretation of evidence that might otherwise change them. Psychologists refer to this as confirmation bias, or the tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information that confirms or supports one's prior beliefs or values, and minimize or critique evidence that seems to contradict previously held beliefs. It's perhaps the most pervasive and damaging type of cognitive bias that exists, and it's probably being exacerbated over time by technology, which is increasingly allowing all of us to exist within our own carefully curated realities. Competing worldviews are at the heart of some of the most intractable problems in society. Indeed, they help drive the process of securitization, i.e., defining a concept or issue as a problem in the first place that we discussed last time. At base, they have two fundamental implications for people who are in the business of identifying and solving problems. First, people will differ in how they interpret objective reality, and I'm not just talking about what color is the dress or whether this is a duck or a rabbit. I'm talking about how they interpret seemingly objective information, especially as it affects how they devise solutions to problems that information presents. Take the earlier example of rising world hunger. One person might interpret that picture as evidence of overpopulation, and infer that what is needed to solve it is family planning or more draconian measures like China's one-child policy. Another might interpret it as a failure of distribution systems, and instead argue for improved social safety nets. As an example of what I'm talking about, let's reflect on the following video.
An environment is a system of living things. The Earth is our environment. The capacity of our environment to provide space, to produce food, and to supply energy are all limited. Humans thrive on less than 17% of the Earth's surface, and only about 4% will grow crops. We depend on these limited resources for our survival, yet we are increasing our population as if they were infinite. This fact is at the core of our environmental problems. On this map, we'll show population growth from the year 1 CE to the present, and project our growth into the year 2050. Population concentrations will be indicated by dots, each of which will represent 1 million people. In areas where people are spread out and don't live in concentrations of 1 million, dots are placed in the middle of their approximate range. Historical references will be provided by images and text at the bottom of the screen. Our population is expected to grow to 10 billion by the end of this century. Yet the Earth's size remains the same. Slowing human population growth and lowering our use of natural resources are key to reducing the impact we have on the planet. Through the decisions we make about our lifestyles, our numbers, and our consumption, we can all help preserve the health and beauty of our home.
This video was produced by Population Connection, a nonprofit organization in the United States that raises awareness of population challenges and advocates for improved global access to family planning and reproductive health care. The organization was founded in 1968 by Paul Ehrlich, Richard Bowers, and Charles Remington in the wake of Ehrlich's best-selling book, The Population Bomb. We'll talk about that book and its thesis more in a few minutes, but for the moment, what might other worldviews make of this data? Please take a couple moments to jot down some ideas and some thoughts on this. What are other ways in which we could interpret this massive uptick in population that has occurred primarily since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution? The second point is that disagreements cannot simply be resolved by resort to objective facts, and this problem accelerates as the underlying subject becomes more complex. And, as we'll discuss at several junctures in this class, subjects don't come much more complex than global environmental change. So, in order to understand proposed policy solutions, you'll often need to understand the worldviews of the people and/or organizations proposing them. Simply throwing new or different data at the problem or into the discussion is unlikely to resolve it. As it relates to environmental security, the issue of competing worldviews is important for understanding how different audiences will react to scientific, seemingly objective data on fish stocks, on land use change, or carbon concentration in the atmosphere, and indeed how those worldviews affect attitudes and beliefs about scientific communication and the role of scientists in society in the first place. It's also useful for understanding why some public policy issues, like environmental issues, never really seem to reach resolution because the sides in the, quote, debate simply talk past one another. In our next meeting, we'll discuss other examples of ways competing worldviews complicate the analysis and creation of public policy. Now, returning to that video, it's important to introduce a key concept borrowed from ecology that looms large in these discussions: carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is the maximum population size of a species that the environment can sustain indefinitely given the food, habitat, water, and other necessities available in the environment. Let's look at a concrete example. Growing up in Michigan, the deer population was always a topic of discussion. Hunters looked forward to deer season, and drivers in rural areas feared it. At any rate, the deer population is governed by two limiting factors. One, the carrying capacity of the forests and meadows where they live, in terms of forage, i.e. stuff to eat, and water. And two, predation, both by their natural predators like gray wolves and by humans. The blue dashed line represents the carrying capacity of the ecosystem, or the maximum number of deer that can be sustained without harming the underlying resource, the forest, on which they depend. Especially when released from predation, such as by the widespread eradication of wolves in order to protect sheep and cattle herds, deer procreate and their numbers grow exponentially, which is represented by that spike that exceeds the carrying capacity. Once carrying capacity is exceeded, however, problems set in. All the low-hanging branches and grasses have been eaten, so animals begin to starve and weaken, making them more susceptible to disease. The population then crashes, but permanent damage has been done. Because the ecosystem itself is renewable but exhaustible, it can be overused. All the overgrazing and damage to trees and other plants mean the carrying capacity is permanently reduced. The forest is permanently degraded. The deer population will continue to experience these kind of boom and bust cycles, but at a lower equilibrium population level. These dynamics are widely cited by hunters and hunting groups as why hunting is important for the ultimate health of the animal population and the broader ecosystem. These dynamics exist pretty much everywhere in the natural world. As inhabitants of the natural world, should these dynamics apply to humans? What is the ultimate carrying capacity of the Earth with respect to human population? This topic has been debated vigorously, and not always very respectfully, for at least 4 centuries. It's a debate that ultimately is a contrast in worldviews. We can call the two sides of this ongoing debate Doomers and Cornucopians. Early cornucopians referred to Doomers as wild and mad-headed enthusiasts whose silly speculations and absurd paradoxes are not worthy of attention, while Doomers counted that the cornucopian mindset was put forth by designing knaves who preach upon an ardent benevolence and draw captivating pictures of a happier state of society. It's not exactly the stuff of the Biggie-Tupac beef, but it was pretty strong language at the time, and that time was the end of the 18th century. Let's start with the Doomers, and it doesn't get much more doom and gloom than Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus was an Anglican minister whose most influential works were published in the waning years of the 18th century, also known as the first decades of the Industrial Revolution. From our current vantage point, the Industrial Revolution was a turning point in human society, creating wealth, spurring technological innovation, and helping to foment democratization on an unprecedented scale. Also, it was a turning point that would, as much, if not more than modern warfare, spawn the international system as we know it today. But at the time, the Industrial Revolution looked terrible. English cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and London were coal-polluted, dangerous, fiery hellscapes where whole communities lived tooth to jowl and literally fought with bare fists and knives, for crusts of bread and places to lay their heads each night. Like the informal settlements we see today from Kibera in Kenya to Cité Soleil in Haiti, rapid urbanization and population growth were outstripping by a large margin any preparations therefor. And so, in those days, life in the urban centers of Northwest Europe was grim, to say the least. This was the reality Thomas Malthus was experiencing when he wrote one of the most influential demographic essays of all time. In 1798, Malthus outlined 2 key propositions in his now famous essay on the principle of population. The first was that human populations grow exponentially. Geometric progression is a fancy way of saying population grows in percentage terms, or the percentage of individuals with new offspring in any given time period. So it has the same property as the compounding interest on which many fortunes are made. Take a population of 100 individuals that grows at 10% per year, starting in 2020. In the first year, growth is from 100 to 110 individuals. In the second year, the growth is from 110 to 121. So the overall amount is increasing. By year 8, the population is more than doubled. In 15 years, the population would more than triple. That's geometric growth. The second was that the food supply grew only arithmetically. Arithmetic growth means increasing by constant amounts, not percentages each year. So in our example, let's take a growing area of 100 acres that grows at 10 acres, not percent each year. In the first year, the growth is the same as in the population scenario. But by 2050, the growing area has grown only by 300%, but population has grown by over 1,600%. Malthus thought this made sense, given the prevailing science and logic of the time. This is before the widespread application of technology to enhancing agricultural yields, i.e., the amount of food you could grow in a given area of land. So at the time, the only way to increase production was to farm more, not farm better. And land tends to get scarce pretty quickly, especially if you're on a small island in the North Sea, as he and his audience were. Malthus had an ancillary prediction about the effects of rapid population growth for wages, that it would suppress them as the supply of labor became ever larger relative to a fixed stock of capital. Remember, this was still the mercantilist era. Gold and silver ran everything. They didn't take into account technology or the coming of fiat currency in those days. But his central insight, and the reason we refer to Malthusian dilemmas to this day, was that humanity was inexorably and hopelessly condemned to be like the deer I grew up around in Michigan, constantly outstripping their food supply, only to be brought back in check by means of misery and vice, by which he meant war, starvation, and venereal disease. He was, after all, an Anglican minister worried about the moral rectitude of society. Now, it turns out that Malthus was wrong on both counts. Human population growth is not exponential, but rather logistic, and anticipated to level off by the mid-21st century. Moreover, the food supply has increased faster than population since the 1800s. Despite this, Malthusian concerns have spurred conflict in the past, especially when circumstances in the international system amplified them. We'll talk about that in the context of interstate war in the coming weeks. Let's fast forward to the 1960s and early 70s. famines, or chronic shortages of food resulting in widespread death, are claiming tens of millions of lives, with epicenters in China, perhaps the worst famine in recorded history, Nigeria, and Indonesia. That decade, it certainly seemed like humanity was losing its race against Malthusian dynamics. Hunger was rampant. Into this moment stepped Garrett Hardin, a zoologist whose early research had been concerned with symbiosis, or beneficial interactions between two different organisms living closely together. Mentioning that none of the aforementioned famines were primarily caused by the limits of natural systems. The famine in China was the result of a disastrous experiment in forced collectivization of agriculture as part of the Great Leap Forward, while the famine in Nigeria was the result of food embargoes against the breakaway region of Biafra. But Doomers tend not to dwell on those types of particulars. Hardin wrote two incredibly influential pieces in the late 1960s and early 70s. The Tragedy of the Commons, published in 1968, and Lifeboat Ethics, The Case Against Helping the Poor, published in 1974. In both, he even more explicitly drew on the biological sciences to argue that population growth would ultimately be immiserating. In doing so, he outlined what has come to be known as the Tragedy of the Commons, overuse of a common pool resource resulting in the exhaustion of the resource and the death of the population dependent on that resource base. To understand the concept of a common pool resource, we need to understand two semi-jargony concepts from economics. The first is rivalry. Whether one user's consumption or enjoyment of a good degrades the abilities of others to consume or enjoy it. Take the sandwich. Is it rival in its consumption? Yes, for sure. The sandwich is a rival good. Now, let's take something like a beautiful sunset. Your looking at it does not, unless you're standing directly in front of me and have a large head, degrade my ability to enjoy it. It is a non-rival good. Some seemingly non-rival goods are congestible goods, roads, beaches, and parks. While normally non-rival at low usage rates, they can become very rival when demand is high, and anyone who's ever gone to the beach on the 4th of July weekend knows what I'm talking about. The second is excludability. Is it practical to prevent users from benefiting from the good? Again, the sandwich. Can you prevent others from benefiting from it? I guess it depends on how strong you are. But seriously, it is very easy to prevent someone from accessing the good. It's an excludable good. What about the sunset? Under most circumstances, it is a non-excludable good. The combination of these two attributes, rivalry and excludability, yields a typology of goods, ranging from pure public goods, which are neither excludable nor rival, to private goods, which are both excludable and rival. Most of the things you own fall into the latter category: the device in which you're watching this lecture, your car or bicycle, whatever you're currently snacking on, etc. Some of the most vexing problems result, however, in the provision or maintenance of public goods, like stable atmospheric conditions. We'll come to why in a moment. Club goods are goods that are excludable but not rival in their consumption. For a small example, consider a private health club, where only members can access the equipment. This would be a congestible club good. Or think of membership in the European Union, which confers lots of goods on EU members: free movement of goods, services, persons, and capital within the internal market, and participation in a common currency that are non-rival in their consumption. Your ability to cross from France to Germany does not inhibit my ability to do so. Common pool resources are resources that are rival in their consumption or use, but that can generally be accessed by everyone. Think of the fish in a public lake, or better yet, the ocean. Beyond a country's exclusive economic zone, a concept we'll return to later in the quarter, anyone with a boat and some gumption can fish then. But a fish caught by you is not available to be caught by me. It is rival in its consumption. And this part is really important because most of our discussion will revolve around renewable resources, it is one less fish to procreate and make new fish, replenishing the stock of the resource. So what's this got to do with the tragedy of the commons? A tragedy of the commons can occur when there exists a renewable resource that virtually anyone can use, but each person's use degrades the resource slightly for themselves and for others. In the canonical example, an entire community is free to graze their cattle on an open pasture. Because each member receives 100% of the benefit of use, i.e., their cattle being fed, but the costs, in the form of less forage for other animals, are imposed on the whole community, each member has an incentive to overuse the resource, leading to too many cattle, overgrazing, and the destruction of the pasture. Take the example of the Atlantic cod fishery off the shores of Newfoundland, historically one of the most productive and economically valuable in the North Atlantic Ocean. By the early 1960s, the fishery had been sustainably harvested for over 100 years by small-scale local fishers and migratory fleets. In the 1960s, however, larger industrial fishing vessels began trawling the waters, leading catch to nearly triple in less than a decade. However, these large catches undermined the ability of the fish to reproduce, ultimately causing the population to collapse by the early 1990s. To this day, the fishery has never rebounded to its pre-1960 level of productivity, leaving small-scale local fishers out of work. Hardin applied this kind of logic in a seductively straightforward manner to humans. Since humans derive all of the benefit they receive from having an additional child, but absorb only a fraction of the social cost, less arable land available per mouth to feed, humanity will tend to overpopulate itself, resulting in a Malthusian trap that will either kill off or immiserate the population. He expanded this worldview in 1974 in Lifeboat Ethics to include thoughts on foreign aid. Since all development assistance would do is encourage peoples of the developing world to procreate in numbers beyond their means, it should be abolished. And this attitude extended to immigration as well. Allowing immigrants to consume more and more of an essentially fixed stock of resources would undermine the resource, and in his words, cause the lifeboat to become swamped, with all of the well-intentioned people in the lifeboat extending lifelines going down with the ship as well. Garrett Hardin was, to put it very mildly, a controversial figure. Even his contemporaries found his notions about population control too close to social Darwinism, exuding an implicit developed country and therefore racial bias. By contemporary standards, Hardin has been viewed as an out-and-out white supremacist, aligned with nativist, anti-immigrant organizations, and even having been deemed a white nationalist by the Southern Poverty Law Center. He was at least logically consistent with his own beliefs, committing a joint suicide with his wife once they, or at least he, believed they had nothing useful more to contribute to society. We are not talking about him because he was a good person. We are talking about him because he was and is massively influential in discussions about population growth and the various policies, from family planning to anti-immigration platforms, associated therewith. Just as you can see echoes of Thomas Malthus's logic in Hardin's work, you can see further echoes of Hardin in the thought of contemporary doomers like Niall Ferguson. In our next lecture, we'll talk about solving the tragedy of the commons. And in our class discussion, we'll discuss whether population growth even is a tragedy of the commons according to the logic of common pool resources. Now, Hardin was very vocal, but he was not alone in his dire predictions about outstripping the world's resources. Paul and Anne Ehrlich published The Population Bomb in 1968, the same year The Tragedy of the Commons was published, and predicted that a good thing, the spread of better maternal and early life health care to developing and middle-income countries, was leading to a population explosion that would ultimately outstrip the world's food supply by the 1970s and 80s. Remember the name Ehrlich. It will come back into the story in a few minutes. The Club of Rome, a group of concerned scientists that exist to this day, was also active in these discussions, though their focus was on resource scarcity more broadly, not just inadequate food supplies, but inadequate fossil energy and industrial metal supplies, resources that, due to their non-renewable nature, are truly in some senses finite. Their first major publication, Limits to Growth, was released in 1973 and updated roughly 3 decades later. Now, it's important to note a few things about these influential individuals and the leaders of the Club of Rome as well. First, they were all, save for Malthus, educated as biologists or natural scientists. Hardin was a zoologist. Ehrlich's dissertation was titled The Morphology, Phylogeny, and Higher Classification of Butterflies, Lepidoptera Papillonoidea. It actually ends with no idea, just as I have no idea whether or not I pronounced any of that correctly. The Club of Rome's current director, Călin Georgescu, is a soil scientist. They viewed, both explicitly and implicitly, humans as simply another species in the animal kingdom. Second, they were all respected voices in their own scientific communities. They were not cranks. Hardin was a professor at UC Santa Barbara, Ehrlich at Stanford. Third, they were all making pessimistic predictions that, like those of Malthus, they expected to see come to pass in their lifetimes. Now, we're going to discuss a radically different perspective on both humanity's relationship with the environment and humanity's rather unique ability to identify problems and solve them. The cornucopian perspective, named for the cornucopia of Greek mythology, holds that environmental constraints on human population are much less binding than doomers would have us believe, and argues that the history of humanity is the successful expansion, rather than contraction, of available resources, through human ingenuity and technical solutions to resource constraints. While we began our story with Malthus, Malthus was actually responding to Enlightenment-era thinkers like William Godwin and the Marquis de Condorcet, who believed in the perfectibility of humanity through education and resort to human reason and ingenuity. These arguments were certainly popular at the time. From advances in science, astronomy, mathematics, to music and art, and even governance concepts like the separation of powers and rules for making collective decisions. The Enlightenment was a time of great intellectual development. Where Malthus had looked around and seen burgeoning slums and human misery, others saw how urbanization was creating more productive agriculture in rural areas, generating commerce, and creating new sources of wealth not tethered to ownership of, and therefore competition over, the land. And they believed that rampant population growth was, when you got right down to it, a problem of folks having nothing better to do at the time. Thinkers like Godwin and Condorcet believed that the advances in arts and literature would lead to a future where intellectual development and stimulation would largely displace pleasures of the flesh, resulting in more moderate rates of population growth and increasing per capita affluence. Cornucopian thinking, that human ingenuity ultimately allows us to solve and free ourselves from the seemingly fixed carrying capacity of the earth, was embodied in the more recent decades by the work of Julian Simon. Unlike the Doomers from the biology department, Simon was trained in psychology and economics, two disciplines that focus on seemingly uniquely human behaviors like cognition, complex problem-solving, and decision-making under conditions of scarcity. And economists, for better or worse, think about the concept of scarcity in very, very different ways.
The newspaper stories you customarily read would tell you that we should be worrying about running out of natural resources, copper, wheat, what have you. But the history of the past 200 years, in fact the whole history of humanity, has shown us the extraordinary event, contrary to all common sense, that the more that we use of natural resources, the more we have of them. That is, rather than natural resources becoming more scarce as we use them, they have been becoming more available. When I say more available, I mean that when we look at natural resources with the measure that we as economists use, and the measure that's important to us as consumers, that is, how much do we have to pay to get these resources, we see that the price of natural resources has been going down rather than up throughout all of human history.
When food gets scarce for the deer in Michigan's forest, they either migrate or they die. This was true of most humans for the vast majority of our history. But at least for the last 10,000 years, the most common approach has been to deal with scarcity through devising solutions, like agriculture, to equilibrate supply with demand. As food becomes scarce, it will become relatively more valuable, creating incentives to produce more of it. Plant more land, harvest it more carefully and intensively, manage pests more aggressively. And unlike even other tool-using animals like chimpanzees, humans have a massive advantage in their ability to write and record knowledge, and learn from others whom we've never met, and extend that knowledge in new ways. That is, humans can innovate. This affects the whole notion of resource scarcity or limits to growth in two ways. First, it means that humans can use technology to make existing resources more productive or their use more efficient. In 18th century France, the average hectare, an area about the size of 2 American football fields, produced 1 metric ton of wheat per season. By the 1960s, it was producing 2.5. Today, that same hectare produces 7 tons per season. Recall that in Malthus's calculations, the only way to grow more food was to farm more. Human ingenuity has allowed us to both farm more, but more importantly, farm better. We've learned to become better, more productive farmers over time. And this isn't unique to farming. In the 1960s, Pontiac needed a 6.4-liter gas-guzzling V8 to generate the 325 horsepower necessary to propel its GTO to 60 miles per hour under 5 seconds. That car got about 10 miles to the gallon. Today, Mercedes-AMG squeezes 421 horsepower from a 2-liter engine that gets 26 miles to the gallon, and that car can get to 60 miles per hour in under 4 seconds. Second, it means that humans can find substitutes for dwindling or poor-performing resources, with alternatives being brought to market. As the old saying goes, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. Metalworking allowed humans to make better, more long-lasting tools. To keep with the car example for the moment, electric vehicles are untethering transportation from fossil fuels. While Malthusians were obsessed with peak oil production and the inevitable energy crisis that would follow, energy companies are now worried about peak oil demand. after which oil resources will increasingly be abandoned to better renewable alternatives. The stock of oil as a resource may be finite, but Simon's whole point is that humanity's relationship therewith is and was bound to change over time. Before 1850, oil had no widespread role in human society. After 2050, it may return to that status. The combined effect of both of these factors, market incentives to use resources more efficiently or to make them more productive, and our ability to innovate and find alternatives over the long run, led Simon to believe that in contrast to there being finite biological limits to growth, that humanity's ultimate resource, its ingenuity, would continuously keep humanity one step ahead of the seeming constraints on population growth and prosperity. And Simon was willing to put his money where his mouth was. In 1980, he publicly called out Paul Ehrlich, one of the authors of the population bomb, challenging him to what has become known as the Simon-Ehrlich wager. Simon told Ehrlich to select any raw material he wanted and select any date more than a year away, and Simon would bet that the commodity's price on that date would be lower than what it was at the time of the wager. Ehrlich conferred with his colleagues and wound up picking 5 metals that they thought would increase in price over the next decade: chromium, copper, nickel, tin, and tungsten. Then, they bought $200 worth of each, for a total bet of $1,000, using the prices on September 29, 1980 as an index. They designated September 29, 1990, 10 years from then, as the payoff date. If the inflation-adjusted prices of the various metals rose in the interim, Simon would pay Ehrlich the combined difference. If the prices fell, Ehrlich would pay Simon. Between 1980 and 1990, the world's population grew by more than 800 million people, the largest increase in one decade in all of history at the time. But by September 1990, the price of each of Ehrlich's selected metals had actually fallen. Chromium, which had sold for $3.90 a pound in 1980, was down to $3.70 in 1990. Tin, which was $8.72 in 1980, was down to $3.88 a decade later. Simon won, and Ehrlich paid up. Here's the check. Note the absence of a memo. I guess when you can't say anything nice, you don't say anything at all. Also, note the signature. It was Paul's wife and co-author, Anne, who signed the check. But he seems to have been one hell of a sore loser. Now, it's important to note that if they'd made the same wager in the year 2000, Ehrlich would have made a killing. Prices for all those metals, as well as oil and food, skyrocketed in the 2000s. But that example kind of supports Simon's point. The 21st century commodity boom resulted in higher prices, which created a big incentive for companies and governments to go out and look for more resources, and that's precisely what they did. This table shows the changes in reserves, the amount of resources known to be in the ground and available for extraction, for a basket of key metals and fuels. Reserves for all but tin expanded dramatically in 2018. That is, the price mechanism reflected relative scarcity, and firms and governments responded by making supply relatively more abundant. Now, whether Malthusians will eventually be correct, it's hard to not argue that the historical record has favored cornucopians, at least over the past 3 centuries. Despite Malthus's predictions that population growth would lead to widespread immiseration, the next 2+ centuries have been marked by population growth the likes of which Malthus could scarcely have imagined, but the economy, and thus affluence, has grown even faster. Between 1831 and the late 2000s, the UK population grew at an average rate of 0.5%, but the economy grew almost 3 times as fast. And at the global level, population has grown at about 1.5% per year since 1950, whereas economic growth has averaged 2.2%. The present-day UK is both more populated and massively wealthier than Malthus could ever have dreamed. So, this debate is not going to end anytime soon. Doomers and Cornucopians and the perspectives that they espouse are going to be with us for the foreseeable future. So, what does this all have to do with worldviews? Doomers and Cornucopians are experiencing the same reality, and in fact have been since the 18th century, but they are interpreting it in radically different ways that ultimately rest on articles of faith that most don't even realize are part of their worldviews. Is humanity perfectible? Is the human animal an animal like any other, or are there fundamental differences that render the laws of nature more malleable? Most people, be they voters, policy practitioners, or leaders, are not as strident or one-sided in their worldviews regarding humanity's fundamental relationship with the environment as the Doomers and Cornucopians we've discussed today. But they all have these worldviews, so if you wish to persuade them, one way or another, or just wish to understand where they are coming from, you need to be mindful of the worldview they are bringing to the table. This point doesn't just apply to issues of population and environmental security either. Some people look around at the world and they see threats. Others see opportunities. And they may see them in the same place, looking at the same objective circumstances. So, what's your worldview? If you had to place yourself on the continuum between Garrett Hardin, Julian Simon, where would you be and why? We'll discuss in class.